One of the challenges of using supplements correctly, choosing them correctly, is to know when they're actually deficient. And then, well, take the deficient supplement. Knowing how to work with them together, how to shuffle between them, how to make sure you don't create deficiencies, that's already a professional artwork. But what I'd like to teach you today is a little bit behind the scenes of how a professional actually identifies deficiency. And remember, I'm using a professional slideshow. I'll be skipping some of the text. I'll be skipping some of the slides. Simply, I don't want to burden you with information you can't really work with. But the point being, this is how I actually work. So let's dive in. So it's the art of smart questions, but not just questions, to know how to identify deficiencies in supplements. So the real challenge for a professional starting his path, his or her path in this process is to know how to find the effective questions to identify deficiencies. Because if you just take one sample supplement and go over all the list of potential symptoms that it can create when it's deficient, or should I say the body creates it because it's deficient, then you will find that you have a lot of questions that are similar to a lot of other supplements, because the body doesn't really work just with one thing per one process. It's a lot of interactions and interrelated actions and dependencies and codependency. So the problem here is that we need to find a way to identify those specific questions which are most accurate for each supplement. And along this course, when I go into the specific supplements and talk about how to know if they're deficient, that's exactly what I'll be giving you. I'll be giving you those specific questions, and the or is going to be part of why I'm making this video. Okay, so the challenge is the unique questions, the ones that are specific to a specific supplement. If we can get those, we have a winner. So let's take an example. If you ever run across a situation where you want to swallow water or even a drink and it gets kind of stuck and you have to either regurgitate it or, have a hard time swallowing, but eventually it'll come down. Well, unless this is an extremely acute emotional situation, it's very likely you're deficient in magnesium. And that's a classic symptom to know exactly what goes on with your magnesium. Okay? Doesn't always appear, but if it does, it puts a flashlight straight on magnesium. And of course, like I said, we'll have a lot more examples when we actually go into the specific supplements, because there's no point in talking theory right now. This is not a course for professionals. What about laboratory tests? I mean, isn't that what we're used to? We need something to know something is working or not, deficient or not. We go take a blood test or something, and we have an answer. Well, that's a very interesting question, because in some cases it'll be very practical. If you want to know if you're deficient in folic acid, or rather folate, then having a blood test taken is actually a pretty accurate way of doing it. Okay, free-form iron, for instance, is a waste of time because it doesn't say anything. It's just like, it's the remnants of a broken down blood cell, red blood cell that broke down. It doesn't mean that it's now available to create a new one. For iron, you need to go and check things like transferrin and ferritin. These can be meaningful to know whether or not you have available iron for your system. So knowing which tests and how is kind of the art here behind the scenes. And again, once we get to the specific supplements that relevantly have a useful blood test, then I'll go into detail exactly how at a level that's practical. But in most cases, the problem with blood tests is that they test only what's in the blood, not what's in the cells. And since the blood is kept at a certain level for most supplements, it's hard work for the blood to do that. By the way, magnesium, for instance, if there's a lot of shifting in the magnesium, and a lot is a very small number when it comes to the testing, you'll have a lot of very harsh symptoms. So long before those symptoms appear and the blood shows a change, you'll still have muscle cramps. You already have muscle cramps. You already suffer for a deficiency on the cellular level. So blood testing will be very inefficient in this case. So we'll go into that in details. How about holistic lab tests? I mean, are there tests that are not found at your doctor's office that could help you understand if you're deficient? And there are all kinds of holistic tests out there. I mean, there is a plethora and it's growing every day. I brought a few of them just to show you that, not all of them are necessarily equivalent in weight and value. For instance, a hair analysis test is a very confusing test for an unprofessional to read because it could tell you that you're deficient in zinc, but that, for instance, is inaccurate in most cases. But it can tell you other things that can be accurate under certain circumstances. And if a certain circumstance exists, it'll also show you. And this is where the hair analysis test is actually really a valuable tool. It can tell you under certain circumstances if you have a toxic level of toxic metals. But when it comes to vitamins and minerals, most of them are not really going to, if you know, most of the information in that test is not going to be relevant. So knowing which tests to use and which tests not to use is part of my job. And my job will also be to show you relevant cases when we talk about this in the future. So, but let's talk about fingernail analysis. I mean, that's an old one. That's a really old one. It's not a new test. it's not a new tool, but I've heard so many angles on this. And I've yet to find an angle that I would say to, I want to learn this in detail. Because most of the information that's gleaned through the nails and found in the in the textbooks talking about hair nail analysis aren't accurate. They're not really facts. And the few that are have so much arguments around them. I mean, if you have white spots on your nails, does it mean zinc deficiency? Probably. Some say calcium. Some say magnesium. All the sources are totally conflicting about this. So as far as I'm concerned, despite the fact that I used to use the white spots for a long time as my test for zinc deficiency, now that I have a better test, I've totally neglected nail analysis. I consider it a historic relic until proven otherwise. And then there's all kinds of unique blood tests like the neutron test or all kinds of other, useful potential tools, but very expensive and not necessarily systematic from the experience. From the field, it doesn't always bring results that are necessarily accurate to the patient, meaning I can't trust them. And if they weren't so expensive, I might have actually run 100 of them and learned what to take from it that is accurate. But with tests costing over $400, it has to have enough proof in beforehand for me to actually go and dabble with it. The vitamin C urine test is actually old as well. It's very simple. It just relies on the fact that there's a certain chemical that when mixed with solution that has vitamin C, it changes color. It's a blue pigment and it just loses the pigmentation. So if it's a green test, it turns yellow, because you remove the blue. And there are other similar techniques like a totally blue test that turns white. But whatever, it works. It's a simple test. It's used in laboratories just to recognize the presence of vitamin C, and used correctly, it can actually give us how much percentage of vitamin C exists in a certain solution, like in your urine. So this test is actually super accurate, practical, because apparently what we drip into our urine represents the level of vitamin C in the cells and not just the urine level. So that's one of the tests I've been using for years now. Very, very, very effectively. It's very clear from the results that it's accurate in 90% of the cases. And in the few cases where it confuses, it doesn't really wreck the treatment. It just allows me to understand that within, a few weeks of work with a patient, and I can then just use older systems that I'll be talking about when I talk about vitamin C. Then there's the zinc taste test, the zinc tally test, as it's called in many places. And that too is a very accurate test. It gives us a very clear and distinct feeling when we have deficiency, although it has a bit of a gray area, and that is that when you're very sensitive to tastes, then very often you'll feel it long before it's actually reflecting the level that I need. So that's a more gray area. It requires more you know, more distinct taste for it to turn out to be good, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a useful tool, but there are situations where it can be confusing, and I've had at least two cases where it actually uh, sent me taking about like 1,000 milligrams of zinc a day, which is a hell of a lot of zinc. It proved right, but it still felt like something else was missing there to understand this. So yeah, interesting test. I use it regularly as well. Very, very practical because zinc is super important nowadays. And there are others, of course, but I won't go into all those right now. If and when I find something relevant for a specific case, then I'll present it in a separate video so you can have that information available. And sometimes it's not about testing. Sometimes it's about drawing conclusions. And that's a professional thing. So I'll be mentioning this in relevant places. But very often when I mention that, I would also say, and make sure you talk to your therapist and not just, rely on common sense that's not based on enough knowledge. This is one of those places where it takes a professional to truly draw the conclusions accurately. And very often, even the professional will find it confusing. But the whole idea in this section, this idea is that when you have a situation where it makes sense that something's missing, and then you take it and you see an improvement, clear improvement, then you know that you hit the mark. But you're using common sense, you're not using facts. It's not a symptom that says this is deficient, that's a symptom that says this might be deficient. It's logical that will be deficient. And the example I have here is that when you have high cholesterol, one of the aspects that we know is that cholesterol, when it's high, is actually oxidized more than anything else. It's not just a matter of, the ratios between HDL and LDL and VLDL. That's the old school talking. The new laboratory research processing is talking about cholesterol that's unoxidized versus cholesterol that's oxidized. And so if oxidation is the secret behind high cholesterol, then antioxidants are usually the legitimate and simple solution, especially vitamin E. That's the main antioxidants for the fatty solutions in our body. But vitamin C is also very important because it returns the vitamin E to its original condition after it's done its job, after it treated an oxidant. One out of many tools that can do that. So when someone has high cholesterol, vitamin E is definitely an option, and vitamin C is definitely an option. The thing is, I can easily test vitamin C, as I've spoken before. But vitamin E has only one symptom, and it's only women who have it. I'll be talking about that when I get to vitamin E. So what do I do with men? I can't have them, taking feminine hormones to be able to see if they're deficient in vitamin E. It doesn't work that way, which means I'm left with a deficiency in a symptom. So vitamin E can be a good idea when high cholesterol is available. There are also other tools that might be effective there. But again, working first and foremost using the system of if it's deficient, take it. And then in this case, vitamin E would be my first choice. And only if that doesn't work out, then I would consider supplements that don't necessarily have a clear deficiency symptom, which is a bit of a catch. As far as I'm concerned, is a big question mark, and I'll be discussing that in specific cases. But that's one option. The other option is learning from medications. I mean, if a medication is taken, a conventional medicine, and it relieves some of the symptoms to a great degree, then something it's doing is working. But of course, it's doing it by suppressing the symptoms. Nevertheless, very often I would understand from learning behind the scenes about, how that medication works, what might be the real solution that's, going to be the simple option. It's a lot of research and a lot of digging, and it's a lot of complicated thinking. So I usually save that from the more, bigger issues, for the complicated issues, which are very hard sometimes to break down into components and resolve. But it's definitely an interesting angle. I mean, you can actually learn from how the medication works or don't work about things that could be very natural and correctly used can make a big difference. And of course, if medications worsen the situation, that's very often the case as well. So if you've taken medication and you're like frustrated with the results, make sure you write down those symptoms, that how you reacted or what didn't work, etc. Make it very, very clear, and then talk to me. You can start the conversation below, and maybe if it's complicated enough or you don't want to go into details, we can always move it to private messaging uh, in my community online. And where then we can actually go together into it and understand maybe what that thing is telling you, what the fact that this medication didn't work for you actually means, or if it worked for you and you don't want to continue taking it, what can you glean from that, etc. Okay. And the biggest challenge about all of this is being able to philosophically understand the logic behind the situation. Philosophy is our basic strong point as humans. Using it correctly makes a big, big difference in how we address situations that are complicated. Okay? And health can be, well, quite complicated at times. Most of the time, it's just us being complicated. So, with this said, this is all I wanted to share in this case, but I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to write down your leading symptoms in the response if you feel up to it, if you don't feel like it's exposing you too much. And I'll have the joy of perhaps giving you interesting ideas to think about and how maybe even help you resolve some of those symptoms. How would you like that? I mean, that's the whole point of this course. This is not about just me dumping information into the network. The whole idea of this course, as far as I'm concerned, is to service you, to actually help you be healthier. Okay? That is the main issue here. The more healthy you are, the more happy you are with me, the more likely you are to follow me and become part of this amazing shift that I'm trying to create in the world, where people are simply more healthy because they're more healthy, not because they're more drugged. What do you say? Want to join the fun? Don't forget to sign up to the channel if you don't want to miss the next one. And not just the channel, but the playlist for the course. See you on the next one.